1979, an old widow was preparing to go to bed when she heard the sound of a door creaking open downstairs. Assuming it was her daughter who had a spare key, she walked toward the noise without hesitation. As she reached the kitchen, she was confronted by two middle-aged men standing in her living room. One of the men stepped forward, forcing her to keep quiet, while the other demanded to know where she kept her valuables. The widow calmly told them she had nothing of value, and after an exhaustive search, they confirmed her claim. Frustrated, the men sat at the kitchen table trying to plan their next move. It was then that she noticed their desperate expressions and asked what their intentions were. After a brief hesitation, they admitted they were in trouble and needed enough money to catch a bus out of town. Feeling sympathetic, she decided to help them out. The next day, two police officers knocked on her door, asking if she had seen two men who had escaped from prison. Without hesitation, she lied, fully realizing the implications of her actions. After the officers left, she tried to push the incident out of her mind and forget about it. However, a few months later, an unmarked envelope appeared in her mailbox. Inside, she found a handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you," along with a stack of cash.
Ini adalah kepala pembunuh berantai yang diawetkan. Jadi namanya adalah Diego Alves, yang dimana dia tuh merupakan pembunuh berantai pertama di Portugal. Si Diego ini udah ngebunuh hampir 70 orang selama tahun 1836 sampai 1840. Terus gimana cara dia ngebunuh? Jadi dia biasanya ngelakuin operasinya itu pada malam hari, pada saat orang-orang tuh lagi pulang kerja, dimana dia ngerampok dan juga ngebunuh. Terus tubuh korbannya itu dilempar ke saluran air Agua Livres, yang dimana si Diego ini mendapatkan julukan O Pachada atau pembunuh saluran air. Awalnya tuh nggak ada orang yang notice kalau misalkan ini kasus pembunuhan dan ngira orang-orang yang meninggal di saluran air itu. Pada akhirnya si Diego ini tertangkap pada saat ia melakukan perampokan ke seorang dokter yang terkenal dan ngebunuh keluarganya. Pada akhirnya si Diego ini dijatuhi hukuman mati, yaitu dengan digantung pada tahun 1841. Setelah dieksekusi, kepala Diego Alves dipenggal dan juga diawetkan oleh ilmuwan sekolah kedokteran bedah Lisbon untuk diteliti otaknya. Namun penelitian itu tidak pernah dilakukan dan kepalanya sampai saat ini masih diawetkan dalam wadah kaca yang berisi formaldehida.
In 1993, two men entered an Italian restaurant in Chicago just minutes before closing. The employees, including the owners Richard and Lynn, were finishing up their shifts, preparing to end for the night. The two men, armed and acting suspiciously, waited until the last customer left before making their move. Once the restaurant was empty, they drew their weapons and forced the employees to empty the cash registers and gather in the kitchen. Assuming it was a robbery, the employees complied, hoping to avoid harm. However, the attackers, paranoid about leaving witnesses, herded all 7 victims into the restaurant's freezer. Inside the confined space, they took the lives of all 7 victims. After ensuring no one survived, they destroyed evidence, cleaned the scene, and fled into the night. The next morning, family members of the victims contacted the police after their loved ones failed to return home. When officers arrived at the restaurant, everything initially seemed normal, but opening the freezer revealed the horrific crime scene. The case remained unsolved for 9 years, despite the efforts of over 100 investigators. 6 years after the attack, DNA from a piece of chicken that had been bitten by one of the criminals was tested using technology unavailable at the time of the murders. The DNA matched Juan Luna, and investigators later identified his accomplice, James Degorski. Both men were convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole.
This might be the most disturbing case in American history. This is Elizabeth Short, also known as Black Delilah. She was an American woman who was found murdered in a park in Los Angeles, California. Her case became highly publicized because of the gruesome nature of the crime, which included the mutation of her corpse and her body being completely drained of blood. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, Elizabeth Short's naked body, severed in 2 pieces from the waist, was found in a vacant lot on the west side of South Norton Avenue in the neighborhood of Leimert Park. At the time, Leimert Park was largely undeveloped. Elizabeth Short's mutilated body was severed at the waist and drained of blood, leaving her skin extremely pale. Medical examiners determined that she had been dead for around 10 hours prior to the discovery, leaving her time of death either during the evening of January 14th or the early morning of January 15th. Her body was completely washed by the killer, and she had knife slits from the corner of her mouth all the way to her ears like the Joker. As I said before, her body was cut in 2, and the lower half of her body was positioned a foot away from the upper, and her intestines had been tucked neatly beneath her buttocks. Her corpse had been posed with her hands over her head, her elbows bent at right angles, and her legs spread apart. The crazy thing is, they weren't able to find a single droplet of blood at the crime scene anywhere. Also, they came to the conclusion that she was completely alive and conscious when she was cut in half. Whatever you do, don't Google her name because you will see the picture of the crime scene, and it's absolutely disturbing and just unsettling. I saw this photo not too long ago for the first time in a while, and it stuck with me for a couple of days. This case is extremely inhumane, and let me know what you think about it.
Sometimes true for stranger than fiction. The case of Richard Trenton Chase is a story which even the most depraved horror writer would struggle to create. Over the course of 4 weeks spanning across 1977 and 1978, Richard Chase took the lives of 6 innocent victims in Sacramento, California. His murders gradually progressed in violence, beginning with drive-by shootings and culminating in acts of cannibalism.
Ted Bundy, the charming killer. He was charming, he was intelligent, and he was one of the most dangerous serial killers in history. His name, Ted Bundy. From 1974 to 1978, Bundy hunted women across 7 states, using his good looks and charisma to lure victims into his deadly trap. His technique? Deception. He pretended to be injured or posed as a police officer, gaining trust until it was too late. Women vanished, one after another. Their remains were later found in forests, rivers, and shallow graves. Families were left shattered. Communities lived in fear, and the nation was gripped by the horror of his crimes. That car, a tan VW Beetle, became a mobile prison for Bundy's victims. But one woman, Carol DeRonch, fought back. She escaped Bundy's car and reported him. Her testimony led to his first arrest. In 1976, Bundy was convicted of kidnapping. But before he could face trial for murder, he escaped, twice. After his second escape, he made his way to Florida, where his crimes turned even more brutal. Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house, attacking 4 women in under 15 minutes, beating, strangling, and biting them. 2 survived. His final victim, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, was abducted in February 1978. Her body was found weeks later. Bundy was finally caught in Florida, and this time he couldn't escape. His trial was a spectacle. Bundy, ever the manipulator, defended himself, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 1979, he was sentenced to death for the Chi Omega murders. After a decade on death row, Bundy finally confessed to over 30 murders, but the true number remains unknown. At 7:16 a.m., Bundy was executed in the electric chair. Outside, people celebrated, holding signs, "Burn, Bundy, burn." But even in death, the question remains, how many victims were never found?
In 2016, 3 teenagers decided to explore an abandoned building deep in the forest. As they made their way through the dusty upper floors, they quickly realized it wasn't as scary or haunted as the rumor suggested. Feeling confident, they decided to camp overnight. As they began setting up their tents, everything seemed normal, until they heard a loud noise coming from the basement. It sounded like a metal object falling to the floor, echoing through the empty halls. 2 of the boys, uneasy and paranoid, insisted they should leave immediately. "What if someone else is here?" one of them asked. After some debate, they agreed to check the basement first and continue their stay if nothing seemed out of place. When they reached the basement, the beam of their flashlights revealed a curtain hanging across one of the doorways. Hesitating at first, one of them lifted up the fabric, only for this to happen. Terrified, the boys bolted out of the building, not daring to look back or see what had made the sound. Later that night, they reported the encounter to the local police station. Initially skeptical, the officers investigated the building, but found nothing to substantiate the boys' claims. Suspecting a prank, they considered charging the boys with filing a false report. However, after they showed the footage they had captured, it prompted authorities to take their story seriously. The building was then officially sealed off to prevent any public access. And despite further investigations, whatever was behind that curtain remains a mystery to this day.
However, coined the phrase, "You can't make this stuff up," might have known the story of real-life boogeyman, Albert Fish. A slight, elderly man with grey hair, No one suspected the kindly single father of being sadistic child murderer and cannibal.
In 2008, a man returned home from work one evening, stepping into his apartment. He heard a faint sound, a door softly closing somewhere deeper in his apartment. He froze, listening intently, but after hearing nothing more, he decided to search every room, checking if someone had broken in. However, there was nothing out of place. This wasn't the first strange occurrence. For a while, small amounts of food had mysteriously gone missing, but he'd never given it much thought, assuming it was just his own absent-mindedness. But now, hearing that door, he realized he couldn't ignore it any longer. The next day, he bought a small camera and discreetly set it up in his kitchen. That night, after returning from work and hearing no unusual noises, he checked the footage. What he saw left him horrified. A figure emerged from a cupboard door, slowly and silently. A woman, thin and disheveled, crawled out and navigated his kitchen with practiced ease. She opened his fridge and helped herself to whatever food she found. When she was done, she slipped back into the cupboard, pulling the door shut behind her. Shaken, he immediately called the police. When they arrived, they carefully opened the cupboard door. There she was, crouched inside, her wide eyes staring back at them in silence. She had created a makeshift space with a small pile of blankets, food wrappers, and a few personal belongings arranged neatly around her. The officers arrested her, later discovering she was homeless and had been secretly living in the man's house for an entire year. The woman, Tatsuko Horikawa, was eventually charged with trespassing.
What this woman did to her husbands was pure evil. During the early 1900s, there was a woman named Mississippi who lived in western Florida. In the year 1909, she would marry her first husband named Cucumber at an old mansion venue. But that night after everyone left, it would be the last time Q was ever seen again by anybody. Missy would go on and remarry 10 more times over the next few years, with the same exact outcome every time and oddly enough at the same wedding venue. By the year 1917, she was already a multi-millionaire with all the assets she gained from her widowed husbands. But in 1918, a man named Sal Manella decided to marry Missy, just a few months after meeting each other. The wedding went great, and when all the guests left, Missy asked Sal if he wanted to play a game, and he agreed. So they went to the backyard of the venue, where there was a giant pond, and she blindfolded Sal and connected weights to his legs. And before he could react, she picked him up and threw him in the pond. Missy did not know that someone was watching her and that what would happen next would be complete madness.
In 1998, a sailor was on his night shift aboard a cargo ship bound for Europe, keeping watch over the shadowy deck. Suddenly, he heard a loud pounding coming from one of the containers below. Terrified, since the containers were only supposed to hold products, not any living creatures, he quickly woke up the captain. The experienced captain listened carefully and said, "It could be nothing. Let's check it out, but don't wake the others. It might just be the ship settling." Grabbing flashlights, they moved cautiously toward the source of the sound. As they pried open the container, a figure suddenly lunged out, tackling the captain to the ground. The sailor leapt into action, wrestling the stowaway off, and together they managed to subdue him, tying his hands and forcing him to sit under the harsh glow of their flashlights. The man looked gaunt and exhausted, barely coherent. Realizing the gravity of the situation, they changed course to the nearest port, intending to turn him over to the authorities. After his arrest, police discovered that he had hidden aboard the ship in hopes of making it to Spain. However, lost in the darkness for weeks on end, he had suffered severe sensory deprivation, having underestimated the length of the journey. He was eventually sent back to his home country of Senegal after being held for a month. 1997, a young woman was at a payphone when she noticed a man staring at her from a distance. Thinking she was just being paranoid, she finished her call and drove toward a nearby diner to meet a friend. Unfortunately, on the way, her car got a flat tire, forcing her to pull into a parking lot. To her surprise, the same man from the convenience store approached her, offering to help. Having few options, she hesitated but agreed to let him assist. The man told her to check his truck for a jack while he pretended to inspect her tire. As she got closer to his truck, he suddenly threatened her with a knife, forcing her into his vehicle and driving off. While being abducted, the young woman made a bold decision. Before the man could get onto the highway, she threw herself from the moving truck, landing hard on the ground. Spooked by the busy road and her daring escape, the man drove off without stopping. Later, passing drivers spotted an injured person on the side of the road and called the police. Officers quickly arrived and rushed her to the hospital. She was identified as Sandra Sapah. Once stabilized, she told the police everything that happened, providing a detailed description of the attacker. Using her information, police created a sketch that eventually led to the capture of William Lewis Reese. Ultimately, he was convicted and sentenced to 60 years in prison for the kidnapping. However, after being linked to 3 other cases, including multiple murders, William was sentenced to life imprisonment in 2022. In 1932, an escort sat listening to her radio when she heard a knock on her door. She wasn't expecting anyone yet, but she assumed it was her next client. "You're a bit early," she said with a smile, opening the door. The man said little as he stepped inside, his silence more telling than she realized. She invited him to sit and excused herself briefly, leaving to inform her coworker that she had a new client, a precautionary system they used to ensure their safety. After returning to the room, something seemed off. The room was quiet, and the man seemed to have vanished. She glanced around, calling out softly, but before she could turn fully, she felt a sudden, crushing blow to the back of her head. Her vision blurred as she collapsed, losing consciousness. The next day, her coworker noticed she hadn't heard from her since their usual check-in. When knocking on her door yielded no answer, she assumed her friend had gone out. However, after 2 more days of silence, she grew worried and reported her friend as missing. When authorities arrived, they were forced to break down the door. Inside, they discovered a horrifying scene. Lily was lying motionless on her bed, her skin pale. Nearby, they found a bowl and a towel that contained traces of dried blood. Upon closer inspection of her body, investigators found a wound on her neck, suggesting her blood had been drained. Despite the evidence at the scene, the lack of forensic technology at the time left the investigation to hit a dead end. And the identity of the attacker, dubbed the Atlas Vampire, remains unknown to this day. In 1836, a sewer worker was conducting routine maintenance beneath the city of London when he heard voices echoing nearby. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, as he had been underground for hours. However, curiosity got the better of him, and he followed the sounds until they abruptly stopped. Pressing on, he stumbled upon a massive vault. As he examined it more closely, he realized it was the Bank of England's gold vault, and the voices he had heard were those of the guards above the tunnel. The next day, he began writing anonymous letters to the bank directors, warning them about the vulnerability of the vault. Skeptical at first, they dismissed his claims. Undeterred, he sent another letter, this time providing detailed descriptions of the layout and the tunnel leading to it. Realizing the gravity of the situation, they finally agreed to meet him. At the appointed time, the bankers, accompanied by armed guards, waited nervously. Suddenly, the worker emerged from beneath the vault floor, startling everyone. Grateful for his honesty, the directors rewarded him with £800, a life-changing sum at the time. The incident led to a complete overhaul of the vault's security measures, ensuring such a vulnerability would never be exploited again.
This is a true horrifying story, part 25. Warning, this is not a joke. The information that's going to be shared is dangerous and life-threatening. Do not, under any circumstance, commit the actions that will be narrated. This is the world's most dangerous book ever, Shams al-Ma'arif. This book was written by Ahmad al-Buni in the 17th century. But technically, the author of this book is not a human being. I never did and will never read this book. And this is your second warning. Do not read this book. Ahmed al-Buni practiced black magic, and he was in contact with the most powerful jinns and demons before he passed away. The jinns were the authors of this book. The elder generations, like our moms and dads, have heard about this book, and they were warned by it. There are thousands of horrifying stories of people who read this book. Shams al-Ma'arif explains everything about black magic, how to get in touch with the world of jinns, how to marry a jinn, and the sacrifices you have to do for the devil, and much more. Unfortunately, this book can be easily found online. One day, a Saudi Arabian man that read hundreds of books for a living decided to read this book specifically out of interest and love for all books, without fearing the consequences behind it. He reached the chapter that teaches readers how to get married to a female jinn. He laughed about it. He tried the ritual to experiment it. The first night after finishing the whole book and completing the marriage ritual, he felt someone breathing next to his face. And on the second night, he felt a hand touching his feet. And on the third night, he heard her voice. The man was officially locked in a marriage with a demon. 5 years go by. He met a normal, beautiful woman that he fell in love with, and they both decided to get married. A week before the wedding day, the bride, the bride's parents, and the groom's parents all pass and die in 3 different car crashes. These are the consequences behind this book. And it's also known from many stories of people that have died from reading the first few pages. If you don't finish reading the book, you will get killed. All my stories, all of them, are true incidents that happened one time only. But this book is a product that is permanently available online. I beg you, do not go anywhere near Shams al-Ma'arif. This video is to educate you on the dangers behind this book. Do not go anywhere close to the world of jinns.
Have you ever wondered how accurate police sketches are? Well, this sketch was actually pulled from someone's subconscious during hypnotherapy, so let's find out. In 1960, 4 teens were camping in Finland, and the last thing that this guy remembers was falling asleep. When he woke up, he was in the hospital, and he learned that he and his friends were attached through the tent and that none of his friends had survived. The only thing was that teen, Nils Gustafsson, didn't remember a thing after falling asleep that night. And honestly, that caused a lot of people to think he was responsible for his friends' deaths. So Nils goes to hypnotherapy to see if he can recall anything from that night, and during hypnosis, he starts remembering a face. This is what he described to the hypnotherapist as the person who attacked him and his friends that night. And while this is happening, this man gets admitted to the hospital. He has splotches of red all over his clothes, and the nurses said it looked like he had been running through the woods. And I'm sure you probably see it, but this caused him to be the lead suspect. I cover the whole story this week on the podcast, which has so many twists and turns, including what this guy has to do with the story, so make sure you check it out.